let's get started. Our talk tonight, Measuring Impact, Author-Illustrator Visits Move the Needle on Student Literacy, shares the results of a 26-school study aimed at exploring the impact of author and illustrator visits and book giveaways on student literacy outcomes. We hope you can tell from the title that the impact is good. So it's a little teaser. You'll get more details at the end, but we've got a great story to tell tonight. I'd like to start by acknowledging that while you'll only hear from 3 members of our team this evening, the success of our whole project and really this conference overall is dependent on many people. All of the folks, your organizers tonight, come from Washington College, which is a small liberal arts college in Chestertown, Maryland, where we really focus on undergraduate and community engaged research, and you'll see that on full display in the Busload of Books project. We would particularly like to shout out our colleagues, Erin Coonahan and Michelle Johnson, and our 2 truly fabulous student researchers, Emmy Meeks and Brooke Thomas, who are working behind the scenes with us tonight to make sure everything runs smoothly. Big projects like this take a lot of work, and we're really endlessly grateful for the collective brilliance of these and many other folks who have made this possible. So tonight you'll hear from 3 of us. I'm going to start by providing some background information on the Busload of Books research project. I'll review our rationale for the study, as well as some of the existing research that informs our work. Then Dr. Bridget Bunton will describe our research methods and the sample. She'll share how we organized the research process, how we collected and analyzed the data, and what baseline information we were able to gather about kindergarten through 6th grade students from across the country. And then finally, Dr. Nick Garcia is going to share the findings. He'll answer our team's big research question: what is the impact of an author and illustrator visit on elementary school students? And he'll also share some future directions for the research. Okay, I assume many of you know this story already, but I figure we should probably start at the beginning. The Busload of Books Tour was and is a labor of love and advocacy led by children's book author and illustrator duo, Matthew Swanson and Robbie Baer, who you just heard from a moment ago. In the 2022-2023 school year, Robbie, Matthew, their children, and their dogs got in a modified school bus and spent a whole year on the road visiting Title I eligible schools in every state. At each school, they gave away copies of their books and gave exciting and engaging assemblies about what it means to be an author and illustrator. In this year, they visited 52 schools, at least 52 schools, 1 in every state, plus additional schools that added to the journey along the way. Our presentation tonight focuses on 26 of these schools who volunteered to participate in a research project along with the Busload of Books Tour. You would be right in assuming that a year-long nationwide tour was not Robbie and Matthew's first attempt at school visits. Like many children's book creators, Robbie and Matthew have long offered school visits and assemblies as a part of their work. And anyone who spent time with them has heard many inspiring tales of what that work means to them. How meeting and engaging with children brings them joy and energizes them, and how also at the same time, it often brings them into direct contact with the challenging realities of historically marginalized and underfunded school communities. Wherever they've brought their assemblies, Robbie and Matthew have come back with stories about the kind of changes that happen when kids and creators come together. Teachers reporting that a child who has always hated reading loves their books, or a kid who couldn't focus in the classroom after the assembly sat down and illustrated a whole graphic novel after being inspired by their work. They share stories about how meeting someone with a creative job opened a door of possibility for kids who might not have otherwise seen that as an option for themselves. And stories are also shared about the long impact of these visits, recounted in emails sent months later by librarians who report that they can't keep Robbie and Matthew's books on the shelves, or from principals who noticed a shift in how kids in the hallway were talking about reading, writing, and drawing. In professional journals and other publications, educators share those same stories. They talk about the truly transformational power of author and illustrator visits for their students' engagement, their attitudes, their motivation. They talk about how the curriculum is brought to life when real-world experts come to school, and how books become so much more interesting when children learn that normal people, okay, like mostly normal people, actually created them. So taken together, these experiences create a powerful rationale for continuing the work. However, we all know that the case for a good thing is made ever stronger through research that reinforces these stories of impact with data that backs it up. This is where Busload of Books research comes in. So here we all are. Look at us being so cute and friendly on the Washington College campus. I'll tell you, one of the greatest things about living in a small, tight-knit community like the one we all live in is that cool collaborations like this emerge from simple conversations. When Robbie and Matthew started to plan their tour, the three of us sat down over coffee to think through some of the existing research that would support and reinforce their advocacy work. That conversation was peppered with questions about book access, literacy enrichment experiences, and the long and compounding impacts of generational poverty and structural injustice on communities across the country. As we talked about the tour and its mission to simultaneously bring books and joy to Title I eligible schools and to advocate for resources and opportunities for more children and teachers in these communities, we kept coming back to the same issue. While many people wrote at length about how to organize school assemblies and book giveaways, and often talked about their importance, very little of this work was based in research. As we all know, data is often the key to advancing strong advocacy positions. Knowing something works because we've been able to measure it helps build a foundation for others who are interested in doing the same work. In that first coffee conversation, it became crystal clear that the Busload of Books Tour provided an unprecedented opportunity to measure the impact of these experiences in just the kind of way that educational researchers like it to be done. A large, diverse, national sample of students, a chance to take multiple measurements of impact over time, and the opportunity to understand that impact in relationship to the classrooms, schools, and communities that surrounded it. So what scholarly gaps was the research project trying to fill? First, we'll talk about research on that primary question. What is the impact of student engagement with authors and illustrators? As I noted, there haven't been a lot of studies in this area. When these collaborations have been researched, they've mostly focused on long-term engagements. So think things like author in residence programs, rather than focusing on these much more accessible and frankly much more common one-day assembly-style engagements. When these experiences have been studied, what they found is exactly what you'd expect. Work in schools with authors promotes the real-world legitimacy of the curriculum, and in so doing, it really improves student literacy engagement. Much more research has been conducted on the impact of book giveaways. We know that providing free and frequent access to books at home increases the quality of a household literacy environment, and it enhances student self-directed reading. These are two essential predictors of long-term academic success. However, this research is mostly done with really young children and families. This means we mostly understand the impact of book giveaways for preschool-aged kids, and we mostly understand this impact through data collected from parent perceptions rather than from those children's direct experience. Finally, we surveyed the research on issues related to literacy and equity. There are many studies that explore the complex and lasting effects of structural inequality on the educational experiences of young people. One of the most interesting and striking brings attention to a phenomenon known as book deserts. In low-income communities, children have significantly less access to books and other quality print materials than their more affluent peers. These numbers are truly staggering. Research demonstrates that in high-income communities, there are approximately 13 books available for every one child. In low-income communities, there's approximately one book for every 300 children. So from 13 per child to 1 for 300 children. These disparities, like many issues of socioeconomic inequality, are magnified across other social divides as well, like race and geographic location. Okay, One coffee conversation, hours of literature review later, we arrive at the beginning of a research project, which is a research question. In collaboration with willing schools on that Busload of Books year-long tour, our team would try to measure, for the first time at this scale, the impact of just one visit and one book giveaway on an author and illustrator, and how that impacts the way children in high poverty schools think about reading, writing, and drawing. In our project, we explore the school visit's impact on all three of these key literacy practices. While getting children to read more and more enthusiastically is likely the primary focus of most literacy work, we also acknowledge the essential function that written expression, both through writing and drawing, serves in the development of student literacy skills and attitudes. When Dr. Garcia presents the results of our research tonight, you'll see that we've measured impact in each of these three domains. We think the addition of drawing is a particularly important contribution to this study, and it's made possible by the fact that as an author and illustrator team, Robbie and Matthew's presentations show the important interrelationship between words and images in storytelling. Interrelationships, in fact, are our key to understanding about literacy. Our project is informed by an ecological or sociocultural way of thinking about learning. We understand that all learning happens at the intersection of a wide and complex array of individual, social, and cultural factors, any one of which can shape who we are and how we see the world in big and small ways. Like all things, attitudes and motivations are subject to these many intersecting influences. Our literacy attitudes, how we feel about reading, are shaped by every experience we have, good, bad, or otherwise, that relates to reading itself. Our attitudes in turn shape our behaviors, where positive attitudes about something might motivate us to do it more, and negative attitudes less. Most of the time when we're studying the individual or environmental variables that shape literacy attitudes, we're looking at larger scale or more sustained impacts. How many books a child has at home, for example, or what their classroom teacher, who they work with every single day, thinks or feels about literacy. But we argue, if it is the case that every experience a child has the possibility to change their perception of themselves and the world around them, then we should try to understand all of those experiences in research. This includes exploring how low frequency but high impact experiences like an author visit and book giveaway might also move the needle on student literacy attitudes and motivation. Enter the Busload of Books research project.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bridget Bunton. I'm a member of the research team at Washington College as well. Thank you so much for attending tonight. It's always thrilling to share this research project and its findings with audience members who are passionate about advocating for literacy enrichment experiences for young students. I'll talk to you tonight about the methods we employed to collect and analyze the data from the Busload of Books Tour schools. So what research tools did we use? To effectively answer the big questions that the Busload of Book Tour inspired, we had to utilize two sources of data: our own collected data and existing national databases. Our surveys were designed using evidence-based measures of student literacy attitudes and beliefs. Since it would have been impossible for our team to travel around the country on the bus, however much we would have enjoyed doing that, and administer these surveys, we prioritized designing surveys that were user-friendly for the thousands of participating students and their teachers. This method allowed us to examine the impact of the school assembly and book giveaway on student experience, which I'll share more about in a minute. We also used existing large-scale data sets to learn about community-level variables that would help us understand the difference between the schools we were collecting data from. We could have asked principals or other school administrators to report this information to us. However, for both ease and accuracy, we instead used data from places like the US Census, the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights Data, and the USDA, to name a few. Our team designed brief surveys to be completed by all students in every Busload of Books research partner school. This means that we had to make a survey that was accessible and easy to answer for kids as young as 5 and as old as 12. In using smiley face emojis, similar to what you see on the screen here, for the student survey scales, we were able to help students pay attention and keep track of the kind of question that we were asking. So when did we collect this data? The student surveys were delivered on 3 separate occasions. The first one would have been before Robbie and Matthew's visit. Sometimes it was hours before, or even that morning before they went to the assembly, or it could have been the day before. And then we also collected data from the students immediately after the assembly, which could have been later in the day or the following day. And then finally, 1 month, 30 days after the visit. This method allowed us to see changes in student attitudes and motivations over time. And you can see on the slide the numbers as far as how many student surveys at each data point we have. We also distributed surveys to the classroom teachers at twice. So the first would have been at the pre-assembly point. So they also filled out a survey before attending the assembly, and at the delay post-assembly point 30 days later. We also have the teacher numbers up there in purple. And then finally, we also distributed a survey to the school administrators and other support staff at the delay post-assembly survey point. So again, at the 30 days after the visit, and you can see on the slide how many administrator staff surveys we collected as well. So who helped us answer these research questions? Now let's briefly review some of the characteristics that these Title I eligible schools have who participated in the research project. So first we'll look at community level data, which allows us to know something about the range of schools that Robbie and Matthew visited. Since literacy attitudes are shaped by many factors, as Sarah was also already talking about, we needed to pay attention to as many variables as possible to answer our big research questions. There's plenty that we can say about our school partners, but tonight's focus is on the sample diversity. When a school is designated as Title I or high poverty, we often have one set idea about what that means or what that school looks like. However, we found in our analysis of the 26 participating schools that there's an amazing array of diversity within and among these school communities. So class sizes ranged from 6 students all the way up to 18. The median household income ranged from $31,000 to $99,000, and food insecurity within the community ranged from 5% to 21%. But despite a lot of these differences, they still face many of the same challenges. So how do we measure this impact? So in thinking about this, what are the differences between Title I schools, students, and communities in relationship to Robbie and Matthew's visit? To evaluate this, we use t-tests, which are statistical analysis that compares 2 groups and tells us whether or not differences between these groups are meaningful or just due to chance. In a few minutes, Dr. Garcia will present the t-tests that show change from before and after the assembly and book giveaway. I'm going to share differences between and across groups at the very first measurement point as a way of showing you who is in our sample. When comparing 2 things, it can be easy to tell if they're different by looking at size or amount. But in statistical analysis, in order for there to be a meaningful difference, a specific threshold must be met. While the numerical difference in the score may not seem like much, an increase by even 1/10 of a point could be enough to show a statistically significant difference between groups. And so what did we find in looking at this initial data point? Our first question about receiving the data, after receiving the data, was what are kids' basic literacy attitudes and motivations at the point of the pre-assembly survey? To see if Robbie and Matthew moved the needle, we had to first know where students were before the assembly and the book giveaway. The findings did not disappoint. And we have more than 5,400 student surveys to account for knowing this. On a scale of 1 to 10, student enthusiasm already started out at an 8. Across all states and ages, these elementary students had strong, positive feelings about reading, writing, and drawing already. They reported enjoying doing this kind of work in school and at home. They also shared that people who read books are interesting and that they want more time set aside in school to do literacy work. This finding of overwhelming excitement about literacy from children living in high poverty, resource poor schools can help us address and overcome a deficit mindset that many hold about Title I schools. Enthusiasm for these literacy practices is notably strong among the younger children in kindergarten and first grade. So, what else did we find? Kids want more. As I've previously shared, there's already a very high excitement among these students, so it seems a real challenge to expect Robbie and Matthew's assembly to improve on that, and particularly at a statistically significant level, but that's precisely what happened. Our findings show improvement after the visit that were statistically significant. It's clear kids want to read, write, and draw more in school. They also reported more excitement about spending free time writing, free time reading, and drawing. We have overwhelming improvement for each question. This means more than a change from a frowny face to a smiley face on the survey. It means that the responses are so fundamentally different that they flag real changes in our statistical model. Students want more literacy activities in school, and they want to spend more time doing these activities after Robbie and Matthew's assembly and book giveaway. What else did we learn? Student literacy motivation definitely differs by age. Given that we collected surveys from students as young as kindergarten and as old as sixth grade, we can also comment on how their motivation changed. At the first measurement point before the assembly, we found that our younger kindergarten and first grade students have higher motivation scores than older students, and this difference is also statistically significant. We also found that motivation differs by place. In thinking about motivation, we know that place significantly matters. Think back to the initial statement or the initial idea about student enthusiasm for literacy that we found. This enthusiasm is higher for students living in rural areas than it is for students living in urban areas. With further analysis, we hope to better understand why that is. We also already know that students' motivation declines over time. But more specifically, we discover that this decline is more pronounced for rural students than it is for the urban students. Again, with further analysis, we hope to understand why that is the case. For example, what factors might predict this sharper decline for our rural students as they go through elementary school. And then finally, we found out that books at home really matter. Our surveys asked students to estimate how many books they had at home. Students who reported having more books at home also reported higher scores in attitude questions for reading, writing, and drawing. This indicates that simply having more books visible to kids helps increase their interest and enthusiasm for literacy. Now I am going to turn it over to Dr. Garcia to talk a little bit more in depth about the results we found moving from survey to survey for students.
Am I visible? Now I'm visible. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be talking to all of you and to tell you all about the results that we found in follow-ups. First of all, the results. We find that students who participated in the Busload of Books Assembly and the book giveaway showed immediate improvement in literacy motivation. We documented the changes from school to school that demonstrated improvement. But we also matched the individual student responses so we could narrow our analysis and report individual changes from each student in their before and after survey. So in the results that follow, you'll see the degree of improvement, the differences in improvement between students, and the role that book access plays in shaping these scores. Now, keeping in mind that students tended to report remarkably high enthusiasm scores on our 1 to 4 Likert scale before Robbie and Matthew and before the book giveaway, I'll flag when we find differences that are statistically significant even with those high initial numbers. Now, there are measurable improvements across reading, writing, and motivation scores. On average, each question showed an increase of about a 1/4 point on the 1 to 4 scales. That's a big deal. And in the following, I'll show you both the comparisons between pre and post scores overall and the matched surveys that follow each student over time. We explored 4 specific questions related to improvements in literacy scores as they relate to student grade levels, assembly attendance, and book access. First and foremost, that question number 1 there. In our results, we find increases in literacy scores. So yes, but these improvements across literacy scores are not uniform, and the area of improvement and determinants of improvement may vary. We find that reading and writing improvements were statistically significant in differences between pre and post assembly scores. But when we examine K through first and second through sixth grade differences, the pre-assembly enthusiasm of the younger cohort, it seems to improve, but it doesn't always improve at the levels that are statistically significant in these differences. So the improvements in writing are the greatest among the younger cohort, but the older students still have greater improvements with specific questions in reading and drawing. I guess the big question is about attendance itself, if you want to examine the Robbie and Matthew effect. So we find that Robbie and Matthew matter. It's overwhelmingly positive across. You'll see yes, yes, and yes. And so those signal that there are differences involving whether or not students actually saw Robbie and Matthew, rather than just benefiting from some potential enthusiasm or complementary school activities within the hosting school. Now, finally, that relationship between books and book access and literacy enthusiasm, it appears to match a lot of our anticipated results. The baseline measures of enthusiasm being higher among students that already have a supply of books, that's there in the data. But we also find improvements, and the improvements are most drastic among the students that didn't have books to begin with, that do benefit after the book giveaway. I'd like to narrow our focus to these dimensions of attendance and book access for a moment. The assemblies, they have the potential to increase broad enthusiasm for schools based on school preparations, supportive activities in the classroom, whether it's art projects or specific classroom tasks. But because we identify which respondents came from the students that attended the assembly and which respondents came from the students that did not, we can critically analyze whether or not their actual assembly made a difference to those that were present. And that's where we get to this slide. As we examine the differences between students that attended and those that did not, we saw those attending the assembly report higher post-assembly scores. Moreover, because we were comparing pre- and post-assembly scores through paired t-tests among attendees, we saw changes where the improvements were statistically significant. That's right. So in terms of reading, attendees wanted to read more in their free time, and the improvement in that score was statistically significant in its change. We see notably lower scores in those that did not attend, so their changes weren't statistically significant at all either. The next slide, we see writing. In writing, again, you'll see that there is a difference between those that attended and those that did not. Those that did not attend report lower scores. We find lots of differences in the change among those that attended and those that did not, where those who attended had increases in their scores that were at a statistically significant level, and those that did not see benefits. On drawing, we see something very novel. Now, I don't know what we anticipated in terms of drawing scores because they were quite high at those initial levels. A 3.57 out of 4, that's something high. But again, we're going to see differences in drawing according to assembly attendance. And I think there's lots to explore here, particularly since reading and writing involve foundational skills that are connected to what grade you're in. That grade progression matters. We expected reading and writing limitations among younger cohorts to encounter some kind of difficulty that might suppress enthusiasm for reading or writing, but that doesn't necessarily carry over here. Regardless of whether or not there is dedicated drawing curriculum and complementary acts, we're just seeing some kind of benefit and some kind of difference between pre and post scores. So now let's look at the kids. We know that within the kids, those grade cohorts matter in a big way. We know that kids love reading, and we know that there's reading differences where younger cohorts are outperforming the older cohorts in levels of enthusiasm. The younger cohorts see a bigger increase in writing motivation, and the older cohorts see a bigger increase in reading motivation. Examining the pre and post results by grade cohort, we see that reading was already incredibly high, 3.14 and 3.07 respectively, for how students felt about spending their free time reading. We see that it goes up for both cohorts, but in each of these reading-related questions, we see that the younger cohort has the largest improvement in their there are differences where the younger cohort is outperforming the older cohort by each question. For writing, we see writing involved high enthusiasm among students. There are observable differences across grade cohorts where K1 reported higher scores than second through sixth grades. So we're again seeing that repeated theme. This improvement is carrying over across grade levels. And drawing is presenting the literacy area with the greatest enthusiasm among students, that 3.5 out of 4.0 score, that's high. But given those high initial numbers, we see the improvements, and this improvement is also carrying over across grade levels. You'll see younger students have the enthusiasm that is outpacing their older peers. So what do we say about that? Well, we can't just look at the assembly itself. We should examine whether or not book access is mattering. There is an entire component of the visit that involves the book giveaway. We find that the assembly and book giveaway have a bigger impact on students with fewer books at home, and it appears that book access matters to reading literacy. Because we ask students to report what books are available to them in the home, from a few to many books, we're able to create these comparative categories. We find that there are baseline differences in scores, where reading scores seem lower among students with fewer books at home and higher among students with more books at home. That affects whether or not they want to spend more free time reading and whether or not they want to read more in school as well. Moving on to writing, books in the home seems like a strong predictor, again, of writing enthusiasm. And we observe the strongest improvements among students with the fewest books. In this chart, you'll see that there are baseline differences where fewer books predict lower scores of approval in free time reading, but the improvements among students are greatest among students that had the fewest books at home. It appears that book access matters to writing literacy. That theme of measurable improvement among those with the least books in the giveaway, least books prior to the giveaway, it also carried over to drawing. Now, everyone was excited about drawing, and we tended to see greater enthusiasm scores among those with the most books, but the change is significant where book access matters to drawing. Students that had the least amount of books report the greatest improvement in their post-assembly scores. Now we have to actually talk about what the implications are of all this. Number one, we should discuss the deficit mindset that is applied in political and public discourse. The tendency to discuss literacy and literacy challenges in students, it implicates the individual student as somehow being deficient in some way, or schools as being environments that fail to counteract a deficit. Using our data, we can actually capture the baseline measures of enthusiasm for reading and writing and drawing are all incredibly high. More than that, we also find that the capacity for change is so great among students that have the least resources in the first place. So that deficit model can be challenged in that we don't see that students are lacking any kind of interest or aspirations, and we don't see that students are resistant to change or taking on more reading, writing, or drawing in schools. Quite the opposite. We're able to study the Robbie and Matthew effect by specifically controlling for attending the assembly, seeing Robbie and Matthew talk, and we're able to come up with measurable evidence that can contribute to research and scholarship, rather than have anecdotal evidence that document whether or not Robbie and Matthew are impactful, whether or not it seems like people are happier, enthusiastic about things. We can demonstrate how it translates to student enthusiasm in writing, in reading, and in drawing. This provides a replicable model so that other schools could further be tested, and so that we can quantify whether or not these kinds of activities and interventions make a difference from school to school. We always envisioned forwarding this kind of analysis so that schools, parents, teachers, librarians could advocate for programs like these so that they wouldn't be reserved for some wealthy districts only. It's not a wealthy perk, but instead is something that can be complementary to our curriculum. More broadly, for research within sociology, there's a lot of potential here where we can study schools, interventions, programs, and literacy enthusiasm as a dimension of inequality in place, whether or not schools and communities lack resources or if they lack planning and a complementary curriculum that can counteract limitations to book access. Within literacy research, by examining dimensions of reading, writing, and drawing, instead of just reading based on a test, we can now have a more fluid and dynamic conception of how literacy operates. And of course, the research provides a foundation for advocacy so that people can write grants, appeal to school boards, and have letter writing campaigns. All of this allows better leadership to emerge within school communities. Within schools, we're able to identify how it is that librarians and teachers matter. They shape outcomes in determining whether or not kids are excited about books. We find in our qualitative analysis additional comments regarding whether or not people are having chats in the hallway or going to libraries more. And for communities, we know whether or not authors' involvement in communities, their visibility in these kinds of events, if it's something that appeals to them, where they don't feel like an invited professional, but can appreciate how it is that they affect a literacy environment and a sentiment of school pride from one place to another that they visit. Within policymakers, they can see how specific communities can be targeted for how low income or under-resourced communities could most benefit from these kinds of programs. In terms of what's next, we have a few basic areas. Number one, we have a lot of data to work with in the first place. We have an abundance of data that we are still unpacking. There are delayed surveys that can measure how long this kind of boost to enthusiasm will last. We have qualitative comments to review, where we can see whether or not there's more that we're not capturing just surveys alone. We have additional web tools that we're developing so that we can have capability to diffuse this information to other advocates in the communities. And of course, we have follow-up relationships. We want to just keep tracking the good works that Robbie and Matthew are doing as they move on to virtual visits versus in-person visits. All of that has great potential for research and numbers, as well as practical exploration of whether or not schools can incorporate an author illustrator visit to where they are. I think that the work ahead can draw from lots of research and data sets that have been developed, that haven't been deployed, by asking students in schools what's going on. So as we're able to give our analysis, we're able to situate students within classrooms. Do class sizes matter? Does teacher experience matter in shaping the results that we've seen? Within schools, do the resources matter? Does it matter whether or not there is a librarian or a library? Does it matter whether or not there's supportive staff? Does it matter whether or not the per pupil spending levels provide greater capacity for change and intervention and complementary curriculum? And within communities, does it matter whether or not hunger is prevalent in a community? Is that something that's going to affect or suppress baseline enthusiasm among students, or somehow mediate the improvements that they could provide? All of that is going to be involved in the work ahead. I'll tell you that when it comes to exploring the virtual visits throughout this school year, Robbie and Matthew have 12 busload of books visits that we're along with virtually. There are 6 in-person visits that they have that we're going to be involved in surveying efforts for those. We'll be able to compare them with 6 virtual visits as well. It's possible that we can examine whether or not virtual visits are an as effective option, or whether or not they provide their own unique obstacles or capabilities in terms of funding and bringing people to remote places. That new research on virtual impact has 5 participating schools already, and we can't wait to unpack what that means for the impact of Robbie and Matthew's visits. Now, I'd like to extend my thanks to everyone who made this research possible in the first place. Specifically, the growing relationship between our research team at Washington College involved our wonderful author and illustrator duo, teachers from across the country, relationships between kids themselves and their books. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to all of these contributors that made this research possible, but also the supporters that we've had within Washington College, without whom we would never have had surveys mailed or student researchers to be on board, or this event. Specifically, the Faculty Enhancement Fund, the Cromwell Center for Teaching and Learning, the Holstein Program in Ethics, and the Goldstein Program in Public Affairs. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks. With that, can we open things up? Oh, of course, please do visit either of these for more information. Follow Robbie and Matthew. Go to Busload of Books. If you want to see any of our output, you can go to busloadofbooksresearch.com. My thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Dr. Garcia, and everyone who's here. Guess we'll do a little virtual clap. I know in the audience, you're all clapping along as well. And hopefully you're eager to ask questions. We think the Q&A option is available to you. So you should be able to, at the bottom of the screen, there's a little question mark in a box. If you have questions, you can submit them to us via Q&A. We have time to take a couple of questions now, and then we'll be able to break for a few minutes, let everyone get up and stretch and do what they need to do before we invite Dr. Joy Erickson for our keynote address.
While the questions are rolling in, I want to say how Robbie and I sat here with goosebumps and pride to hear you all present on the remarkable work you've done. And
I did some crying, everyone. I'm sorry to say, but I wept a little bit about the impact of this and like what great work these guys did. They worked so hard, and all of our schools who participated. I'm so proud of everyone. It just makes me so grateful and happy that this project was able to do what it did because of this research project. So awesome.
And I want everyone watching to know that when Dr. Teresa heard what we were up to, she and her team, within just a few weeks of very nimble thinking and responsive action, rearranged 2 years of their lives to take advantage of this opportunity, build a whole infrastructure, sought funding, just worked to the bone to make this remarkable research exploration happen. We are so grateful. As much impact as we may or may not have had on the ground, you are exponentially increasing the meaning, the depth, and the reach of what we were up to. We cannot thank you enough. All right, enough of that. Please turn to your questions. We will sit here and listen eagerly for your answers.
And thank you. And as much as Dr. Bunton suggested that we would have liked to be on the bus with you, I will say we were happy to be at Washington College riding along. Actually, let's just speak for myself and say that, though we are looking forward to more and sort of maybe some more in-person opportunities this year. All right, we've got some questions coming in. I'll take the first question and then I'll sort of farm the rest of them out. So Lindy asks, is there any research out there for impact for middle and high school age students? This is a great question. Busload of Books was K to 6, and so the data that we have directly from kids on this project is really for our youngest students. However, if you go to the Busload of Books research blog, you'll see a parallel study, a white paper from a parallel study that we conducted that's teacher information only, but that looks at perceptions of challenges and opportunities related to author and illustrator visits for middle and high school educators. And so while we don't have direct information from middle and high school students, we have the beginning of an advocacy platform, we'll say, for folks at the middle and high school level who are interested in bringing additional resources to their schools.
I can jump in to answer the second question. So Raven asks about the time of year of the visits, noticing the differences between younger and older grades, wondering if testing cycles. This has been a constant part of our conversation in analyzing the data over the last couple of years, not only with testing cycles, and that actually also came up with our teacher advisory committee when we were talking with some of the teacher contacts at the research schools over the past couple of summers, that thinking about not just testing cycles, but also recognizing that some of the visits happened very early in the school year. And so a kindergartner in September is very different than a kindergartner in June, right? First grader, right? Particularly if you're thinking about those early literacy skills. So at this point where we have talked about this topic and we would like to delve deeper into it, but haven't really gotten the opportunity to look very specifically or very closely at the impact of the calendar, right, on students' responses. And maybe, I don't know, Nick, if there's anything else you can add to that, because it is interesting. It's been something we've talked about a lot.
And that said, the testing cycles are interesting because they really do vary from state to state for who's doing the test prep and when. So we tend to, or am I speaking personally? We tend to think in terms of fourth grade as being, you know, a key grade where you see the testing come in. I just attended a back to school night, and every other class is talking about meeting the teacher, and ours is just here's how testing's going to go. Get ready. But I just ran some numbers here where we can control for the season and time of the year, so pre or post winter break, and control for fourth graders. And when I do that, I find that after winter break, fourth graders aren't showing as much improvement in the enthusiasm in the enthusiasm about reading or writing. It's still going up, but it's slightly lower. I can do some controls and further testing on this, but yeah, I can compare several hundred fourth graders before and after winter breaks. But I think that it's going to involve me being a little more knowledgeable about testing years for each state that they go through.
Yeah, and part of this
great
is
suggestion.
Yeah, no, it's definitely true. And I think, first of all, can we just talk about how Dr. Garcia was like, hold on a second, let me answer your research question right in a second by just plug and playing. This is one of the many reasons we love having Nick as a team member. But there are so many more questions we can answer with the data that we have. And so I see there are questions in the chat about sharing high-level takeaways in a document and sharing additional information. I think it's a great idea for us to sort of put this all in one page. We're also pursuing, like academics, the slow and painful process of publishing this, which takes, for many of you know, an inordinate amount of time to do. So we'll also are getting our information out that way, but sharing information and outcomes and sharing this video after the fact on our Busload of Books blog is an initial way that this information will remain available to you. So we have a couple of questions and let's do, I think maybe we can do two more. I want to give us at least 4 minutes of break. That's my goal. Okay. Nick, Ryan asked, to what extent, if any, did sort of differences in language affect results? So this isn't something we analyze at the level of the student, but like many things, right, this is data we can look at a school-wide level. So can you just speak a little bit to what that might look like moving forward?
Yeah. So I just want to make sure that we have both possible levels of this question. On one level, I want to give my assurances to Ryan that we did have translated surveys that match prevalent languages spoken within each district. So we sent off our materials for translation purposes. I think Robbie and Matthew might be able to talk more specifically about their comfort in interacting, in confidence in interacting with students, that everybody was on board for the language that was spoken. But because I can connect each of the schools they visit with federal data from the federal data, I can know with certainty how prevalent English language learners are and what languages are most prevalent. Moreover, I can also tell that even if schools aren't capturing that data really well, I can learn what kinds of language are most prevalent within their school district more broadly. So not just students, but the households. So I guarantee you, Ryan, we want to look at it, but I think we're kind of buried in a number of questions right now. So I can't tease out those answers unless you give me about a half hour to merge it with another data set.
No more on the spot research required from you, Dr. Garcia. I'll say, because I'm going to keep my promise about giving you a little break before we start up our next session, a couple of other folks are curious about how people can get and be involved in Busload of Books and Busload of Books research. We have a teacher advisory committee for schools that have been participants in the project. Dr. Bunton is the point of contact for teacher advisory committee. We have Robbie and Matthew, who are highly available on the internet for talking about their decisions for sort of and how they're making choices and putting out applications for participating in the Busload of Books tour. So you have them to reach out to. We are email answerers and blog maintainers, so we will are happily and easily accessible in those ways as well. And we would love to continue being in contact with you as we do more and more of this analysis and have more and more exciting stuff to share. With that, I'm going to ask Dr. Bunton to put up our first slide and give you all a 3-minute break to stretch and do what you need to do before we invite our amazing and dynamic and delightful keynote speaker, Dr. Joy Erickson, to join us starting at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. Thanks, y'all.